Hi, and welcome to the New Stack Makers, a podcast where we talk about at-scale application development, deployment, and management. We're at Serverless Conf Austin for a day of podcasting, talking about serverless technologies, those who are using these emerging technologies, and the practitioners and vendors who are helping users to onboard and adopt serverless methodologies. Hi, I'm Benjamin Ball from the New Stack. I'm joined today by Florian Motlik, consultant at Cloudthropology. Thanks for joining us today, Florian.
Thanks for having me.
We're at Serverless Conference Austin, and this is still kind of early on the first day, and my understanding is you have a talk on day 2, right?
Yeah, I'm talking tomorrow about tooling and how the tooling space needs to develop for serverless infrastructure and for teams really to be able to use the whole ideas, all the services behind serverless infrastructure most efficiently, basically, and why I think some of it is going in the wrong direction, some of it is going in the right direction, and why I think it should go in the future.
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk quite a bit about tooling when we look at new ecosystems, and obviously we've gone on endlessly about tooling in the container ecosystem.
Yes.
So I actually have to make sure I go to that talk because I'm going to be really interested in see what you say about serverless tooling and maybe the direction we're going in versus the direction it should be going in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think Docker or container infrastructure in general is a good example of container something, there's a lot of heavy lifting that happens in your tooling that you do for containers, from Kubernetes, there's a lot of really heavy technology in there, which is very different to the serverless tooling because the heavy lifting is done by the services. The important features in serverless infrastructure, serverless tooling that we need is more UX, accessibility, making it possible to combine 50 different, in and of itself complex services, but the usage of each one of them isn't that complex, but the accessibility and making sure that everything works together well and you still understand and all of your team understands what's actually happening there, that is the heavy lifting that our tools need to do. But they're still too much focused on this feature, on the complexity that we had in the past, where it wasn't so much about the UX and making it easily visible to everyone, and more about okay, we need to configure this huge system, keep it running and all that kind of stuff. And we don't really have to do that anymore. That's done for us. So that's kind of a little bit different. And I think the container to serverless ecosystem shows the difference in tooling and the needs pretty well.
So that's interesting. So would it be doing the topic injustice to say it's about streamlining some of the user experience, or? Absolutely.
If you look at things, for example, on AWS with the AWS CLI, it's basically the AWS CLI is a great tool to talk to the API directly and call commands in there, but doesn't have a lot of developer usability, not a lot of things that go beyond the simple, just run this for me. What's the output? I still have to go into the console a lot, and just to see what things have changed. And that's okay if you have EC2 instances and you have very little surface area that you need to regularly touch. If you have 50 different services in AWS and you use all of them in one way or the other, constantly having to change between okay, this page on the console and this page on the console and this page on the console, that's not really a great experience. And our tooling needs to be closer to the developer and help them to see that information faster and get there without having to constantly cycle through the console and other areas.
Is that something you think people are going to naturally start to focus on as the space matures, or is this, I'm going to keep drawing comparisons back to containers, but it seems like something where the technology behind it is growing, and so there's a large focus on how we actually use it versus optimizing it for the user. Is that something where you just would expect this to happen no matter what, or is it something where you think people need a kind of a nudge to say, hey, this needs to happen now?
I think it's both to some degree. I think serverless really started out on the web tier. It really it got its first traction of hey, I can just put an API gateway in front of it and then scale my web backend basically forever. I think, which is a very interesting and important use case, but in my opinion, the even more interesting and more transformative use case in the future is having small Lambda functions, and the same applies to other providers as well, but small pieces of code as glue everywhere in my infrastructure, just small code that sits everywhere and does small things. That is things that weren't really possible before that. I could build an auto-scaling web tier in the past, more painful than to do it with Lambda and serverless infrastructure, but it's not completely different from the past. But that whole putting glue everywhere in your system, and making sure that all these different services that you weren't really able to use before, because there's always some small part missing. There's always like, it does 80% of the features or 90% of the features that you need, but the little bit more that you need, you can now very easily do through that glue code. Where in the past you would have to do like a cron function or run some server somewhere or something, that in the end you just wouldn't do it. You would fall back to whatever tool you used in the past, stand up an EC2 instance, set up a service or like a cloud, a queue system yourself instead of using SQS or whatever. And I think that's the, in my opinion, longer term, more transformative part. But that's also where the tooling needs to be a little bit different. The tooling needs to be very close to the cloud provider and needs to expose whatever the cloud provider gives you easily. But if you build more abstractions on top of that, then you're stepping too far away from the provider. It's really hard to use whatever they give you. It's really hard to include new services. So I think as that push comes away from like serverless is web backend to serverless is the glue code everywhere, I think that needs a little bit of different tooling and a different sense of how we approach it. And I think that's coming now. And I'm definitely doing my part in pushing us in that direction. And I think a lot of people are. But I think that's something, it's just a young ecosystem. Web tier is the most obvious one to start. But now that we're moving past that, the tools are starting to go there, catch up, and people understand. And simply people run into that issue. Like it's just painful on a daily basis, so people have to figure this out now, because those pain points come up way more often now than I think they did in the beginning of serverless.
So speaking of working yourself to push some of these issues forward, how long have you been focusing on the serverless space with consulting?
With consulting for about like half a year now. Like before that, when being at Serverless, for example, like obviously spent a lot of time like working with larger companies, and before that, like to really understand like how they want to use the tooling and where that goes. I think now in a consulting role and consulting with larger enterprises, that's a very interesting place to be right now, because there's a lot of like open questions from all of these enterprises. There are a lot of teams in those enterprises that I see at least that want to use some of these tooling, some of these automation tooling. And I think especially with them, the glue code is really important, because they often have like lots and lots and lots of internal tooling, internal stuff that doesn't need to scale. There is no need for it to scale, but there's a lot of places where you need small things to happen. And so that seems to me, at least from my experience with my current customers, that's what where a lot of interest comes in, automating specific things, automating, watching CloudTrail. A lot is in like making sure that certain regulations internally in the company are adhered to, and you don't really want to run a service or server for that, but a mix of like config, CloudTrail, Lambda gets those teams very, very far.
So you mentioned teams within organizations. This is something I kind of always ask. It really doesn't even matter which ecosystem it is, but as long as someone is adopting a new technology, especially in the enterprise even, is this something where you're seeing smaller teams or parts of the organization are adopting it and experimenting with it, and that it expands to the rest of the organization, or is this something where it is usually an isolated team that's trying it for the first time? Basically, what kinds of customers you're working with and what scale they're using it at.
Yeah, so I'm, for example, currently working with a large pharmaceutical company, and like their goal is like they're setting up a first project now and setting up first projects in a serverless infrastructure, and that includes a web tier, and that includes like a lot of glue code on the back end. And they want to learn about like what's the standards, the procedures that you need to do, what are the toolings, what can they put out to the rest of the team and kind of sell that to the rest of the company in the long run, to make sure that they really understand like how this works in the beginning before rolling it out. Like they're very like that small part, and like that specific digitization team is very forward looking, but they also understand like in a pharmaceutical company it takes a while to roll things out. There's a lot of regulations in place, so you want to make sure that you have some standards in place that you can tell everyone like, okay, do it this way, like this works. If you need to do it in a different way, like we'll make it work with you. But like, here is how you get started. Here's how you start out. Here's the small places that you can put things in the beginning to really get a feeling. And I think a lot of it is also about like getting into the place where you have the gut feeling that like, it's fine. This is fine. This is going to be around for a while. Like we can do this. And it's really good to have like small project and start out with small things, because there's very little buy-in that you need to do to like have a few Lambda functions that react to like internal infrastructure events, to CloudWatch log events, for example. Yeah, that's great places to automate things, but they're really easy to do, and they require relatively little buy-in from a lot of teams. So that's what I see where people get started and then move further.
Yeah, that's part of the reason I bring that up is we, in the container ecosystem, I guess, have talked about the barriers to entry.
Yep.
With serverless, it seems like a low level of investment is
Yes.
needed to start experimenting with it. Obviously, taking that to the larger organization might require some organizational level, I don't know, changes
Absolutely.
or at least policies. But it seems like that's something where people can start experimenting, and something that starts in a small team could make its
Yep.
way to a organization-wide strategy.
Absolutely. They don't really have to buy in. I think that's a big part. They don't have to buy into a new provider necessarily, new tooling, in many ways, really new way of doing things, because you can't just drop these few things in the right places. You don't go like, hey, let's put our website on like serverless infrastructure and rebuild this whole infrastructure. Like that's not, at least in my experience, not happening at first, but they can very, very slowly adopt it in places where it makes sense and then expand from there. And containers are kind of a change. I mean, they are and they aren't. Like it's still servers in the old way. It's just you can split them up more and there's a few process changes. But the burden seems to me to be a little bit more on the container side from the companies that I've experienced with. So
Yeah, I don't think we'll find a lot of people that disagree with you. Actually, here we just had a podcast where that kind of same statement came up, and
Yep.
and frankly, I'm going to keep asking about it because we kind of made our bread and butter talking about containers, and
Yep.
and obviously, if this is something where it's easier, it's something we want to point that out, and
Yep.
it sounds like there's a lot of benefits there. So,
Yep.
do you spend a lot of time convincing customers that this is a space that is growing and mature enough to invest in? Or I ask this because we talk a lot about enterprises that are hesitant to adopt new technologies. Do you find people come to you with this in mind, or do they need a little bit of convincing?
So it's a little bit self-selecting because I'm specifically focusing on like companies that want to go cloud and a little bit more in that serverless direction. So I think the companies that I'm working with simply are already kind of going in that direction. So I would be hesitant to give a more general statement than that.
Sure.
But I think generally, like going into the cloud, and like a lot of larger teams seem to already be convinced that they need to go more into the cloud, which is just a short form of saying we need to focus on the things that we can do best, which is our product side and not infrastructure. We shouldn't manage all that stuff that we don't need to. We need to have something that is more dynamic, where teams can easily add new resources when they need it. We can benefit from existing services that AWS or other cloud providers build, so we don't have to build and manage them ourselves, and can be more focused. And I think that's something that I certainly see, again, very self-selecting crowd. But I think once people are bought into the like cloud area, like they go more and okay, like how can we use the different services? And serverless and Lambda is just an extension of that. So I don't feel like the same level of like convincing is necessary once they're already kind of bought into cloud, because as like one guy here always said, like maybe serverless is just super advanced cloud or cloud 2.0 or whatever that specifically means, and isn't really something new. It's just an extension of what we've been doing for a while now, and what AWS has really told people and hammered home that message like at least for 10, 15 years, and obviously all the other cloud providers as well. So that message is, I think, starting to sink in, and we just feed them a little bit more to say, and by the way, like, how about you don't have to manage your compute at all for like these small things at first, and then for these larger things in the longer run as well. That's kind of where I see it.
Is this something where, and sort of I want to touch this before we wrap up, are there any particular focuses for you right now? You've talked about the tooling around serverless. Is there anything else, any pain points, or just anything you're looking to focus on specifically, especially in the near future? Yeah,
definitely. I think the two large areas for me are tooling, and then the second one is like making sure that in your infrastructure you can converge against a certain standard that you set internally. So things from CloudTrail, AWS config, making sure that everything is standardized and that you have the reporting to really show that your AWS accounts and all the different AWS accounts that you manage, because typically in larger companies it's not one, it's dozens, or I've even seen hundreds in a company. And I think that is really important, because I think too often we try to set standards through tooling, so we enforce rules through tooling. The problem is people work around those and then do other stuff in their accounts and that we don't want to have. So without the setup that a config, a CloudTrail, a CloudWatch, and whatever can bring us, and the reporting to understand all of our accounts, are all of our resources working in the way that we intend them to? And if not, how can we report that back to the teams? And how can we give them the tools to be able to say, this is really close to like what AWS does, but we give you enough usability to easily move to where that standard needs to be. Like a standard that you want to roll out across all of your accounts, you don't need to be like okay every single day, every single time. You need to have a process to get there as quickly as possible. And I think those two things are what's really interesting me at the moment. How can we make tooling better, and how can we report people if their infrastructure is still in the space, in the place that they want it to be, and how can that be fed back into the tooling side? So that whole, like, I understand what's happening, I totally get what's going on in my account, I know what everybody's doing, and I know who has either needs help or needs a little bit of a slap on the wrist to just follow what we've set the standard on.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us today, Florian.
Thanks for having me.
I'm looking forward to hearing more from you about your about the tooling and all this later in the conference. But thanks for joining us. I think we had a great conversation.
Absolutely, I agree.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Listen to more episodes of the NewStack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcasts. Also, please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.